morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us for today's Coresight Conversations Founders Forum. We are really excited to have Kathleen Breitman join us today. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our host, Deborah Weinswig.
Great. Good afternoon and welcome to our Founders Forum. I'm your host, Deborah Weinswig, and I'm honored to be joined by my good friend, Kathleen Breitman, and her husband, Arthur Breitman. Kathleen is the co-founder of Coase, a software company that aims to lower transaction costs online. Prior to Coase, Kathleen co-founded Tezos, which is a smart contract platform, and many of you probably know. Prior to that, she was at Bridgewater Associates, Accenture, and the Wall Street Journal. I will turn it over to Kathleen to introduce Arthur.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deb. Yeah, Arthur's helping me pinch hit a little bit today because my throat's feeling quite sore from spending all my time on Zoom calls. So thank you for letting him participate. So you're getting like 1.5 for the price of one. But Arthur's my co-founder with Tezos, and prior to that, he was working at Waymo, which is the self-driving car group that spun out of Google X. And prior to that, he worked. Boy, if I screw up your bio, I'm really in trouble, aren't I?
Okay.
Yeah, but he was working in high-frequency trading on Wall Street for a while, so he's a bit of a polymath. I'm allowed to say that because I'm not. I'm sitting next to him. But he's been very gracious to join us and talk about blockchains, which he knows very well.
Great. And for those of you joining us, as always, we'll have a video available on our site in 24 hours. We will launch poll questions after we start the call and then review them. And then if any of you have questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen during our conversation, and we will get those addressed. So first, Arthur, we had a brief introduction from Kathleen, but can you tell us a little bit more about your interest in cryptocurrency and kind of how you got here?
Yeah, so cryptocurrency is at the intersection of many fields that I was already interested in. And, you know, I was interested in political theory and in particular in these things that can increase individual freedom and sovereignty. I was also interested in cryptography because my background is in mathematics. I was interested in computer science. And so all of a sudden, you had blockchain and cryptocurrency come in the intersection of those three fields. Oh, and finance, you know. So I was almost kind of like the perfect target for this.
Perfect victim.
Confluence of interest. So I fell in the I fell into it very, very early on.
What's a typical day for you like?
Well, right now it's quarantine. We're under quarantine. You know, it's locked down, and we're in Singapore. But mostly what I do is I talk to a lot of people. There's a lot of developers in the Tezos ecosystem, and I often have discussions with them about design and about how Tezos might be able to evolve. I also work on some of my own projects, and one of my hobbies is trying to do like these little research projects. And they're kind of all over the place, and I tend not to finish them, so that's not great. But I have more time now to work on them, so that's been pretty good.
What are some of the topics you have either researched in the past or you're researching right now?
So right now I'm interested in language modeling and language compression. So there's a link between whenever you have a natural language model. In AI, you can turn that natural model language, that model into a compression algorithm. But part of the problem is that we've been building these huge models, which do very, very well at predicting, but which are huge. So you look at neural networks like GPT-2, which came out of OpenAI, and it's gigabytes and gigabytes of parameters. The question is, how do you make those networks smaller? And one approach has been called distillation, where you train a smaller network to do as well as the other network. But there's another one, which hasn't been very popular, which is called data distillation, where you basically try to create a synthetic data set, which is going to represent the content of your network. And I think there's something interesting here. So I'm just playing around and exploring this idea.
This has nothing to do with Tezos.
No, absolutely nothing. That's just like,
in case you're like trying to figure out how they connect, it doesn't.
I appreciate that. And as it relates to NLP, and not to go too much down the rabbit hole, but we've seen a lot of use cases in the healthcare industry. Can you help us think about some use cases as it relates to retail?
I'm not an expert on, so we're talking about NLP. So I'm not an expert on, I would say even in NLP, I dabble, I read the papers, but I know enough to be dangerous. I'm not, but I don't know much, I don't know that much about retail. I haven't really thought about like, how would I use NLP for retail? It's definitely like, there's definitely been leaps and bounds in like over the past 2 years and how good NLP has gotten. I did a little bit of NLP when I was, when I was in finance, trying to basically parse the news and trade based on, like, you see a news wire arrive, you don't want to know, is it a good news or a bad news? So a little bit of that. I'm not sure how it might be helpful in retail. Some of the stuff that people were talking about a few years ago were sentiment analysis. So if you're a brand, you want to track, how are your customers pleased with the new product? What are they saying about it? I would say beyond that, I think there's probably a lot of things here. I just don't know enough about retail to come up with a good answer on the spot of like why you might why you might want to use NLP. But I will say this: it has gotten really, really good, and also one thing that's important to know in terms of AI is that now you have so much that is available for free. That you have so much that's already ready. I think it's important that companies have teams in-house that understand how this thing works and can plug it, but it's not, what used to be really a research job is now more of an engineering job. You're an engineer in the sense of like, you can grab a model that's been trained by Google or by OpenAI and then that they put out for free, and you can take it in and use it directly. So this thing has gotten very, very easy to access. Now you can get really, really good models for free.
So, and I might even like be kind of cutting into our poll questions, but from a retailer perspective where we don't tend to have, significant engineering teams, if a lot of what we're seeing from an AI perspective is moving from kind of research, which is more strategic and theoretical, to the tactical around the engineers, how might retail as a sector, which understanding you're not an expert, but how might a sector who doesn't have enough talent, how would they, maybe be left behind?
I think you can. I think you can train the talent for that. I think if you get, it doesn't. Like I said, a lot of it has become a lot more simpler. It's really, it has become a lot of it has become plumbing as opposed to research and development. And so I think if you get talented people even out of universities and give them a little bit of guidance, you can get there.
Great. Kathleen, do you want to talk a little bit about Coase and what it does?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so Arthur and I kind of co-founded Tezos together a few years ago, and the mainnet, or the prevailing mainnet, launched in 2018. And so we were left with very little free time, but still some free time. And so the question was, we created a smart contract platform. What's a good, pragmatic first few use cases that can be sort of fully digitized, that can prove out our theses. You read a lot about how blockchains are making, lowering transaction costs, and that's kind of one of their value propositions. But a lot of this assumes, I guess, some interaction with the quote unquote real world. What I wanted to do is build sort of solutions that would touch a fully digitized economy, which is how I came upon games as the first use case. So Coase builds better secondaries markets, but we're starting off with games because games are sort of end-to-end digital. It makes it simpler to deal with. And the idea is to take those learnings and to progressively make cryptocurrencies and smart contracts more useful for people.
Just so everyone on the call understands, Kathleen, do you mind telling people what a smart contract is?
Oh, sure. That's right. I'm so sorry. We do a lot of crypto podcasts. My apologies. So basically, in cryptocurrency, you basically exchange information with another party, and that's how you exchange, Bitcoin or whatever it is. A smart contract adds extra conditions to that. So it acts as like a wrapper on the transaction. And it says, I'll trade 2 Bitcoin with Arthur if these conditions are satisfied. The analogy that's given in the original paper that proposes smart contracts is a vending machine. So you can think about it very simply as like, oh, I have this apparatus that takes money in, I make a selection, If the amount of money that I've given and the selection are available, then, you know, a candy bar drops down. And that's like a very simplistic way to think about a smart contract. But I think if you take it to its logical extension, you're kind of doing programmable money, which is really cool. And so smart contracts kind of allow you to expedite business logic and keep it all in the same ledger as the currency that you're trying to deal with.
So I'm sure many people on the call have heard about Bitcoin. Can you talk about some of the other currencies and if there's a compare and contrast?
Yeah, I mean, you want to take that question? Like,
yeah, sure. So Bitcoin is by and large the first successful cryptocurrencies. There were tiny experiments before, but really Bitcoin is the one that really that really made it as a cryptocurrency. It's still by far the most successful today. There are other cryptocurrencies which have been launched, and some of them have been basically copycats. So you had, for example, Litecoin, which, you know, took the source code of Bitcoin, changed a few parameters, and then launched and saying like, hey, you know, Bitcoin is gold, and we're going to be silver, and that was it. You know, that was just the gist of it. And so you had some of those, but you also have some which have tried to introduce more innovative features. So you might see, for example, there's Zcash, and Zcash used very advanced mathematics and cryptography in order to give you privacy. So you could compare, you know, Bitcoin being using HTTP in the internet and Zcash being using HTTPS. You know, it's secure. So instead of every transaction being broadcast and public to everyone, your transaction can be private, like you would expect a normal transaction to be. There's been Ethereum, which has been a smart contract platform. I think it's the second largest cryptocurrency now. And the idea is that trying to be even more programmable than Bitcoin. So that's instead of just doing simple transactions, you can create entire programs on top of Ethereum. And, you know, the one we created, Tezos, is also a smart contract platform. It uses a different form of consensus. And the main drive behind Tezos was realizing that a lot of innovation were just being created and added as new currencies. Like, oh, we want privacy. Okay, let's create a privacy cryptocurrency. And we want more programmability. Let's create a more programmable cryptocurrency. And you can't hope to become a global currency if, you know, every 6 months there's some new innovation and you end up having to create a new currency for it. That doesn't work. And so basically I can
network effects.
Well, easily it doesn't succeed. Yeah. If it doesn't succeed, then you miss out on innovation. And if it does succeed, then now you've disrupted your old money. And so that now it's no good, and that's not good either. And so, you know, there's basically one variant of the world where none of these innovations matter in some sense. People say like, well, privacy is not that important, programmability is not that important, and everyone just sticks with Bitcoin. That's one side of the world. The other side of the world is saying like, hey, actually all this innovation matters, but how can we have something that keeps up to date and is not going to be obsolete? And the idea of Tezos was primarily to have a blockchain that wouldn't become obsolete because it had the means internally to upgrade itself, to keep being current. And so the idea of Tezos is that it has a mechanism to update itself. It can become better over time without having to have a lot of big coordination problem around changing it.
Okay, so this may help you with, you know, kind of some of the questions we address. So for those who are joining us today, do you have a blockchain strategy? 85% do not. Do you own Bitcoin? 85% do not. Who at your firm is leading your blockchain strategy? And it's to be determined for 75%. 15% are using an internal team, and the rest are using an external consultant. And I think it goes back to, you know, with most of the people on the phone being from the retail industry, it's, you know, like what I've seen, Arthur and Kathleen, is that we'll have amazing conversations at a very senior executive level, so strategic, and then once it moves down to the tactical, it kind of gets lost. What do you think happens there, and how do you think, like, how can we help retail understand the benefit?
So I think there are some benefits, and I do think there are some use cases. But I also think that a lot of enterprise use cases have been oversold in terms of like what blockchains offer as a value prop. And to be clear, in many cases, it's not that the application that is being proposed doesn't make sense or isn't doable. It's not that the technology does not allow people to do what they wanted to do, but most of the time you will see proposals which are fine, but don't actually require blockchain. And sometimes, we've joked that it's sometimes you have a bit of a stone soup effect, where the idea of a stone soup is someone comes in and in a village and he has a stone, and he starts making stone soup by boiling the stone, and the villagers say like, what is that? It's like, oh, it's stone soup. And they say, is it good? It's like, oh yeah, but it's even better with carrots. And so they bring in carrots and they bring in potatoes and so on and so forth. And at the end you have an actual soup. And so sometimes, blockchain has just been a way for some businesses to, it's been an excuse to overhaul their IT practices, to launch new lines of business, to launch new things, which don't actually really require blockchain. And what I suspect is that what might happen sometimes is there will be an interesting proof of concept in an innovation labs. And then when it comes down to the bottom line to launching it, there'll be either a lack of interest from the clients, or it won't make business sense. And I think that may be probably the, if I had to guess, the thing that ends up killing it is that it doesn't end up like adding enough value to justify its existence for many use cases.
The few use cases we've heard is this idea of kind of sheep to shelf, that you want to understand kind of where if it really is organic cotton, where it came from. And so there's that aspect. And then secondly, we work with some folks at the MIT Media Lab, and I really like this part of it because there's a really kind of human caring component, where when much of this product is made in, let's say, Bangladesh or India or China, if you as a ultimate consumer of the product, if you want to try and go back, right, and tip the person who made your garment or was instrumental in the garment, that this would allow you to kind of get back to them through, kind of the blockchain and actually tip them. So those are the two from a retail perspective that has kind of come up in conversation the most. So
yeah.
Maybe we can look at those two use cases, because I think everyone on the phone is probably somewhat familiar with them.
I like the tipping angle. I think when I say that it's been oversold, I think the financial use cases of blockchains have been a little bit undersold, and the non-financial use cases have been oversold. I think when people saw Bitcoin, a lot of consultants were uneasy with the monetary aspect, and so they quickly pushed for purely IT use cases. And the one you mentioned, which is traceability and supply chain tracking, it's pure IT, and so it's held a lot of appeal. And the thing is, it's like I do think there's value in having in recording the supply chain of a good and so on and so forth, totally. But you can also do that completely without a blockchain. It is true. Like, can you use a blockchain to track the origin of your lettuce? Absolutely. Can you do it without a blockchain? Absolutely. It's really a matter of making sure that you have the infrastructure to record everything as it happens. And if you do that, you can have that on a database, because ultimately you're going to have to trust the sensors. You're going to have to trust the people who have actually input the data, and whether they input it on a blockchain or whether they input it in a database is not going to change that much. So that's the main thing. I think for financial use cases where you actually have to transfer value, then it doesn't, value and information don't exactly work the same way. And anything that's information, basically the information is, in some sense, it is its own thing. If I have a piece of information and by itself it contains enough elements to establish its authenticity, then it doesn't matter what that information is. So long as I have it, it's going to speak for itself. If there's value, then you need consensus. Then it's not just a piece of information, and then you need all the machinery of using blockchains. And that's why tipping applications, loyalty point application, digital twins application, I think are more promising than the ones which purely involve recording information.
So one of the, unfortunately, and I'm sure it's just gotten worse over time, is this idea of counterfeit authenticity web goods. And right, yes, if I think I'm buying a certain brand of handbag and it's something else, it really stinks for me, but it's ultimately not going to harm me. What we've seen is one of the largest retailers in the world, one of the largest technology companies, one of the largest platforms in China have started to work together on this idea of traceability through the blockchain as it relates to food. And the two areas have been like pork and eggs. And what's happened in many cases, right, is the egg is not ultimately the egg that the chicken laid. So how do you think about this differently between, kind of something around a healthcare aspect or something you're going to actually, digest or ingest versus, my handbag?
Yeah, so I think one thing to address is that so sometimes people will say like, oh, it really doesn't matter to do any tracking because people can lie, and therefore if people can lie, then they're going to be able to get away with it. So that's not completely true, because. So I'm reminded of, there was a scandal in Europe a few years ago with meat, and it was horse meat that passed as beef that ended up in frozen lasagnas. And the idea is that probably you have some cheap meat, and then you're going to relabel it as beef meat, and then you're going to sell it. Now, imagine that you're recording the meat every time it's handed over from one person to another. Like, yes, in theory, you could still like lie and say like, this is like beef meat, but now you have more beef meat which has appeared out of nowhere. So you would have to like tag another one and say like, well, that one is horse meat. So you could swap the two, but you wouldn't have an interest in swapping the two, because what you want is like increase the quantity of beef meat. And the same thing with a handbag. In theory, you could like pass off some fake handbags and put like a digital tag on them that makes them pass as real. But then you don't have the digital tags to make the fake ones pass as real. So there is something to be gained here. You could swap it, but you're not going to gain that much. So that I think is potentially interesting. But that only works if people really, really care ultimately in having the certificate. If you have a market for people who will not care that it doesn't come with a certificate, then you lose this property. So if you have people who say like, I want to bag a real Louis Vuitton handbag, but it doesn't matter if it has a digital certificate, then all of a sudden now I have an incentive to attach a digital certificate to a counterfeit and then sell you the real handbag. Now maybe with the handbags it doesn't work as well, but with medicine, then that becomes more problematic, because with medicine I can sell counterfeit medicine, and then I can sell you medicine and you can test it and you can see that it's a real medicine. So I would say it's probably going to work better with something like handbags than something like medicine. Okay,
that's very helpful. And then can you tell us just a little bit more? I think there's always been a curiosity around the crypto community. How has thought leadership move forward, and just kind of who's in this community, and how has it continued to develop?
So I will say that you have people come in for different reasons. You have people who came in from the political ideology angle. You have a bunch of finance nerds. You have cryptographers. Academics started coming in a few years ago. They are. I think there's a lot of people in there on Twitter who are into like trading this thing and doing some speculation. So it's a bit of everything. I suspect that most people who own cryptocurrencies are actually, they're not publishing academic papers and not writing code. They're not like talking about trading it on Twitter. They're just people who are interested into it, who are intellectually curious about it. But you just don't hear that much about them. But having funded a project, I sometimes meet those people, and they're not. I will say that what you see online doesn't necessarily reflect what the actual community is like.
Well, it's like any new web culture. It's like you're gonna get the weirdos coming out first.
Lovable weirdos.
Lovable weirdos, yeah, like us. Yeah, it's signal to noise ratio is little deceptive.
Yeah.
What role do the academics play in the industry?
So I think that they come up with great new ideas for how to improve these blockchains, or they can come up with they can find flaws in existing software. So there's been a lot of academics around developing zero knowledge proof. So that used to be a bit of an obscure field of computer science, and now it's a huge thing. So we in the past years, there's been an explosion of schemes for doing zero knowledge proofs, which it used to be this small part of complexity theory.
Maybe you could explain what they do and why that's relevant.
Yeah, so a zero knowledge proof is basically I know something, and I want to prove to you that I know this thing, but I don't want to tell you what it is. A zero knowledge proof is a way to do that. So we both know a computer program, and I can tell you I know an input for that computer program which will produce a certain output, and you're like, prove it, and I give you a proof. And what's really cool about it is that even if the program takes a very long time to run, and it's a huge program, I can give you a tiny proof, and in a tiny amount of time, you can check it and be convinced. And you have learned nothing about what I told you. And this is helpful if you want to build things like privacy-preserving cryptocurrencies, for example. So there's been an explosion in academia around that. Consensus algorithm, it used to be that all the consensus algorithms that we knew were difficult to implement and clunky. PBFT, practical Byzantine fault tolerance, completely dominated the scene. And now we have an explosion of algorithms. Some of them are extremely simple to implement now. So there's been a lot of research in those directions. I will say mostly cryptography and distributed systems research.
There's been very little in the way of like finance and sort of practical things coming out of academia. There's a whole trend going on right now in the cryptocurrency space around, sort of decentralized finance and sort of replicating. Well,
there's a paper by Tarun Chitra on which is like a finance paper on
yes,
on DeFi. So there's some. It's
he's the exception that proves.
Yeah, it's coming. There's not been a lot of economics article yet. There's some. There definitely are some, but I would say just in proportion to the number of papers on distributed systems and cryptography. But it's coming. Finance and economics.
So maybe for this group, I actually, full disclosure, have been in my lack of travel time during the COVID crisis. I've been spending my own time studying cryptography because I'm personally fascinated. But can you, for this group, help us understand kind of what is it, where are we, and what does the future hold?
Wow, that's a big task. So, first of all, cryptography is very old. You had cryptography in the antiquity. It wasn't very good. It's gotten a lot better since then. But the very first thing that cryptography tried to do was to encrypt messages. I have a message. I want to send it to my generals, but I don't want a message to be caught through enemy lines. And so I'm going to encrypt the message. And the idea is that initially we know a secret, and then using the secret, you can decrypt the message. The enemy doesn't know the secret, and so they can't decrypt the message. Fast forward to World War II, the Germans are using the Enigma machine in order to communicate with their U-boats. And you had a crack team formed in the UK with Alan Turing, a founding father of computer science. And together they started building the first computers just so that they can crack the code used by the Germans. And so for a long time, basically encryption was what cryptography was, and it was essentially that. And then it started going into new and interesting directions. One was asymmetric cryptography. So the idea is that instead of the two of us needing to share a secret, you could have what is called a public key, and I would have a secret key. And anyone could encrypt messages that you can read. Anyone could just do that without knowing any secrets, but only you could decrypt them. And so now that's very, very convenient because you may not be able to send a secret around an enemy line. And if the enemy, if the more the secret is shared, the more likely it is going to leak to an enemy. So here, you're the only one knowing the secret. So asymmetric cryptography was a really big deal. There's also been cryptography used for signatures. So instead of just encrypting a message, what you do is you authentify a message. So you write a message in a way, and then you sign it in a way that only you could have signed it. And so no one can forge your signature. And once you see the signature, it also binds you to the message. So it's, it's clear that it was signed by a person who knows the secrets, and it was this message and not another one that was signed. So digital signatures were really big. And most of the cryptography used in blockchains is more, it's more centered around these digital signatures than it is around encryption. It's more about, you authentifying that, hey, I've made a payment, and this is a proof that I approve this payment with a signature rather than encryption. In fact, sometimes you will hear blockchains are encrypted, and they're really not. Everything is generally in the clear on a blockchain. And what else to say about cryptography? I think it came as a surprise for some people that a lot of the machinery used in cryptography came from very abstract and theoretical branches of mathematics that people had been studying for centuries and thought were completely devoid of any practical use cases, until all of a sudden it became a big industry to use cryptography to secure communications, to secure transactions on the internet, and very recently for blockchains and cryptocurrencies.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to the more formal Q&A. So anyone on the call, if you have questions, please just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The first one we have is loyalty applications are intriguing. There can be and should be value on both sides of the relationship for the retailer and for the customer. But how can blockchain and the complexity this introduces bring value to a retailer and value to the customer and possibly transparency for both?
One of the approach I think is cool for loyalty points is having mechanisms where somehow I can have loyalty points for one brand and use them with the other brand, with the expectation that the other brand is going to pay a kickback to the first one. So let's say I patronize store A, and I get some points there. If I spend them at store B will actually have to pay a kickback to store A because I'm a customer of store A. And so you have a mix between it's good for the customer because I get to spend my points in more places, but it's also good for the retailer because you still get to have the loyalty effect in some sense. You're not completely closing your ecosystem, but you're not also just like letting your competitors benefit from the loyalty points that you've created. So there's some intermediary scheme between being like pure fungible monies that you can use anywhere and between being a loyalty point. And so that's potentially interesting. There's also the fact that sometimes you just use you mentioned complexity, but there's also a lot of convenience in having things on a blockchain. I would say once you cross the complexity threshold of being there, after that it's kind of downhill. And so agreeing on a standard for loyalty points would make it easier for people to have applications to manage those loyalty points and actually use them. I probably have some loyalty points for some stores, but I have no idea, how many I have. I don't have an easy way to look it up. I have to log on some different websites. I may actually pay more attention to my loyalty points and use them more if I have an easy way to check them. It also, I think, can bring some trust in the retailer. I'm not a very big traveler, but I do travel, and I oftentimes don't bother with the airline miles because I figure by the time I figure out how to use them, they're probably going to take them away from me. I don't understand all the fine prints. If it's on a blockchain and if there's something that's very clear and very readable, I'm not saying I'm going to go and read it, but a lot of people are going to go and read it, and they can say okay, yes, this is, they're not going to take away your points, or your points go out after 1 year. So the rules are very clear, the rules are auditable, and the transparency that it reads, I think, may make it more interesting.
Okay, the next question is, organic products require a chain of history to validate their authenticity. Am I correct in understanding that blockchain does not offer a significant advantage over the traditional validation mechanisms?
So I'm not familiar with the traditional mechanism, but if I think of how you would do this on a blockchain, pen and paper. Okay, so yes, no, it does have an advantage over pen and paper, but that's the thing. It's oftentimes I hear about a blockchain and I will say well, you don't need a blockchain, but then I hear about what it's replacing and I'm okay, well, you know what, use a blockchain. It will be better than what.
It can't hurt.
It can't hurt, right?
It's there's this whole idea, I think, almost in retail, and maybe I'm kind of dreaming too big, but there almost is this opportunity to kind of just leapfrog because a lot of the infrastructure hasn't been put in place. So maybe you can talk to that and also, to this question.
Yeah, but the point is I don't think you really need to leapfrog. A lot of these, I think what people need is really a digitization strategy more than a blockchain strategy. Get the digitization right, and then figure out if you actually need a blockchain once you've done your digitization. And you might find that you don't, but if you do, then it'll be a very easy bridge to cross.
Well, it's also the Starbucks gift cards anecdote is a good.
Yes, the Starbucks gift card anecdote is one of my favorites. So
and Arthur's here to tell it. Great.
Yeah. So Starbucks has a few $1 billion hanging around in loyalty cards. And a few years ago, there was a white hat hacker who found a bug, and the bug he found is that there was an option on a Starbucks website where you could transfer your Starbucks. I don't know if they call them Starbucks, but they should, right? It would make sense.
They should definitely call
you could transfer your Starbucks bucks from one card to another, and basically you would call an address that sounded like starbucks.com/mycard/transfer from card A to card B, balance equal 10, to transfer $10 from card A to card B. And he was like, well, what happens if I have $10 on card A and I ask the website to transfer to card B, but at the same time, I also ask it to transfer to card C. So I make two requests at the same time, one to transfer from card A to card B and one to transfer from card A to card C. And he found out if you did that, you ended up with minus $10 on card A and $10 on card B and $10 on card C. So congratulations, you've made $10.
Created $10.
Now, the interesting thing about this story is that someone had to write the website and someone had to write the database for Starbucks to do this. And Starbucks is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So, you know, they can afford really good engineers if they need to. And that engineer wrote that database. Now, at what point I would assume that engineer took a database class. And in the very first class he took on database, the professor went over when the final would be, how much homework would count in the grading, and when the TA hours were. But in the second class, he went over atomic transactions. And he probably used a very example of people having an account and not doing it at the same time, and explaining that you don't like first debit and then credit. It has to happen all at once or not at all. And so if even a very large corporation like Starbucks with billions of dollars hiring someone who took the classes, if even then couldn't get this right, then maybe after all, it's not such a bad thing to leapfrog to blockchain and not have to worry about it, because even though it may be overkill in some sense, you know, you could have a custom solution, but you actually need to build it, and who's going to build it? And so maybe it makes sense to have a bit of an overkill solution just because it happens to be available.
I don't disagree on this. We still haven't seen the digitization of the supply chain. It's, I would say, very much in its infancy. And I would assume that COVID, you know, kind of helps these companies leapfrog and think differently. Can you talk about how you think COVID changes, you know, the blockchain Bitcoin landscape?
I mean, one of the obvious ways it has changed it, is that a lot of you know, the Federal Reserve has reacted to the crisis by printing a lot of money. You know, Bitcoin was created right after the first, you know, the financial crisis of 2008, and it was in reaction in part to the loose monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. And so you're seeing this again. And so if a thesis around cryptocurrencies are right, then they're even more right with a lot more printing going on. So that's the first aspect. In terms of the supply chains, I'm not a supply chain expert here, so I can't really speak to that. I understand that they're being very disrupted, obviously, by COVID-19, that there's like extraordinary challenges which are being created. You know, you find things that break in weird and different ways. I read the other day that you have a lot of ethanol plants, you know, that shut down. So in the US, you need to add ethanol to gasoline by law. You mix the gasoline with some ethanol, okay, and it subsidizes corn production. But now people are not driving, so they're not getting as much gasoline, and so not as much ethanol is produced, and so the ethanol plants are closed. But the ethanol plants sometimes produce CO2 as a byproduct, which is sold to the water treatment plants. And so now the water treatment plants have shortages to clean the water because, so you're uncovering all this tangled mess that exists in society. So that's fascinating. Does it answer? I'm not sure it answers the question, because I don't know. I don't know. I would assume that after the virus goes away, and I think it will. It's not clear if it's in a year from now or if it's months from now, but it is definitely going away at some point. I think we're pretty much going to, I think those supply chains are going to reconnect, and I don't think something fundamental is going to change about supply chain. I think there's probably going to be greater awareness about their importance and about their resiliency. Maybe people are going to want transparency about supply chains. I think that we may see regulation asking stress testing of supply chains, saying like, hey, if there's a pandemic and all of a sudden we have no exports from China or no exports from India, what happens to our local supply chain? So maybe a push for transparency in supply chains could breed some demand for blockchain-based supply chain solution, but I'm really speculating wildly here.
That's helpful. There's a fairly basic question, which is, can you go through how blockchains decrease transaction costs?
Yeah. So blockchains replace a lot of intermediaries. Kathleen was talking about smart contracts earlier, and I like to sometimes refer to smart contracts as automated escrow. So I have, let's say I have a contract with someone, and one thing we could do is we could draft a legal contract, and then, best case scenario, I get paid, but if there's a dispute and we have to go to court and it's long and it's expensive and so on and so forth. It doesn't happen with a vending machine, in the sense of like, sometimes a vending machine can break, you won't have your, the candy bar doesn't fall, but with good enough engineering, the rate of defect can be driven down very, very, very low. And being able to automate the execution of your contract means that you're skipping a lot of intermediaries, which add a lot of cost. So, you
can also test a lot up front.
Like, you have a lot of payment systems that exist around the world, but they're all siloed. You have tons and tons and tons of payment systems. They don't talk to each other. And so every single time there's some intermediary, which is going to add time, which is a cost, which is going to add their own cost. And that's just for money. If you're talking about digital securities, for example, which are an interesting application, the fact that you could potentially, send one from, one place in Europe to a place in India in a matter of seconds and for a penny, it's not something you can do today with any of the legacy systems.
Thanks. We've got 2 more questions. Are there exchange ratios between various Bitcoin currencies, example, Bitcoin to Ethereum, as with central bank paper currencies?
Yes, and they fluctuate wildly. It's pretty volatile.
Great.
Although everything is volatile right now.
And last question is, can you give us an example of where you've seen blockchain used, or at least an experiment as it relates to retail?
So I think in terms of use cases, one of the use cases, I would say the biggest use case of cryptocurrencies, as far as I'm concerned, is really having a hard to seize assets. It's about censorship resistance. But if you're looking at more corporate use cases, I think remittances have had some success stories. Yeah. In terms of direct retail, we've seen some retailers adopt cryptocurrencies as means of payments. In theory, I think you can pay with Bitcoins or Starbucks, but I don't know that there's been a lot of interest from people in actually paying with cryptocurrencies, because when they acquire cryptocurrencies, they kind of want to keep them, and if they have the option of just using their regular credit card for something, they might. So I think you have to offer to people something that they would not be able to do without a cryptocurrency. There was an interesting use case for a while. I don't know. I think it's gone away because transaction fees went up. But there were some retailers in the US, especially electronics, who were accepting Bitcoin and selling at cheaper prices with Bitcoin because they didn't have to worry about credit card chargebacks. So I think that's an interesting one.
That's very interesting. There's probably, I think, what we'll find, kind of during this crisis where retailers are willing to think outside the box, that there will be additional use cases, and we'll kind of see it on the other side. But this is definitely a topic that has continued to surface in conversations, and it's very interesting. While everyone's trying to make sure that their house is in order, and they can find, and so they can find all their inventory, and they have better visibility into their supply chain. We are finding a lot of conversations around this, right now.
There's been one use case in France, brand of large supermarkets, Carrefour. They have a product where you scan an item with your phone, and it will show you a statement from the producer who made it, and it's recorded. So you don't see the blockchain; it's recorded on a blockchain. I think it counts because people are actually using it. People are actually scanning the item and saying oh, that's interesting. Here's the story of the producer, and so on and so forth. I think it doesn't count also in a way because they could totally have done this without a blockchain. I think the blockchain is a little gimmicky in this instance, but the people are actually using it. And so I don't know to which extent the people are using it because they're saying hey, it's on a blockchain, or because it's oh, it's interesting. I want to know about the producer from, I want to know about the chicken farmer who made this.
I think what we're seeing is that as there's, more, food allergies and other concerns about, kind of the product that people are purchasing, that there is a lot more interest. We've heard mainly from the grocers in terms of how do you kind of serve up that additional insight to your consumer And in some cases, people literally put in like concierges into their stores to be able to walk people through or walk customers through. And then it's very manual though, right? It's like this one-on-one as opposed to one-to-many. And so that is what we've seen. And this is why this Carrefour example is actually quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's like I said, I think this is going mostly to hinge on, do you have the way to digitize that information through the supply chain, and then whether or not you put that on a blockchain or whether or not you put it on a database or on your website, I think is less important than the ability to create trust in the data that goes in. So, for example, are you filming? Let's say you get the eggs from a farmer. Maybe you want to film the transaction so that you actually have video evidence. That, for example, is more important to me. Having this data and committing cryptographically to this data, I think, is more important than being on a blockchain or not being on a blockchain.
Great. All right. With that, I'm going to close it out. Kathleen and special guest Arthur, thank you so much. This was amazing. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone on the phone learned a lot. And we look forward to having you on again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
You.
Thanks for pinch hitting.
You guys are great.
You just know what that means.
No, I'm ignorant. It's probably some baseball thing.
It's probably some baseball thing.
Some baseball thing. All right. Take care. Thanks so much.
Thank you.